All right, we've come to the part where we're going to be now talking about the master glands of the endocrine system. And as we mentioned, those are going to be the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So just to give you some context, I'll put up an image over here of how this is physically arranged in the brain. But if we've got the hypothalamus, we can sort of show that if the hypothalamus is up here, the pituitary gland, which kind of dangles down from it, is actually two different structures that are attached to each other that are actually fairly different. The anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. So hopefully you can see how these diagrams interact. We're going to talk about both of them, but I'm going to actually start with the posterior pituitary because in a way it's simpler. The funny thing about the posterior pituitary is that it's not actually a gland. The posterior pituitary is actually nerve tissue. What it mostly consists of is axons from a couple of areas in the hypothalamus that come down here and then have axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. Those terminals are then going to be releasing what would otherwise be a neurotransmitter, but now it's what's called a neurohormone, releasing their transmitter as a hormone into the blood. So actually that blood vessel comes sort of down here. But in any case, the posterior pituitary has two hormones that are actually made in the cell bodies in the hypothalamus and then travel down their axons and are released into the blood in the posterior pituitary. Those hormones are oxytocin and vasopressin. Vasopressin you already know about. It's also known as ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and it is primarily involved in regulating water reabsorption in the kidneys, the collecting duct. We've talked about that already. Although, as it turns out, there is also vasopressin used elsewhere in the brain. There are vasopressin receptors in the brain that seem to be involved not in water regulation, but in some aspects of social interaction, oddly, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, oxytocin, which is a very similar hormone structurally, these two are closely related. Oxytocin has a couple of main functions. One, it causes contractions in reproductive smooth muscle. We normally think of it as being the hormone that's involved in causing contractions of the uterus during labor, which is true. It is a hormone strongly involved in that. If anyone knows anyone or is anyone who's ever had a labor induced, it's often induced with Pitocin, which is a synthetic version of oxytocin. It causes those uterine contractions. In males, oxytocin also seems to be involved in causing contractions in some of the smooth muscle that helps to propel sperm through the sperm ducts. So it's involved in males too. Oxytocin is also involved in milk letdown. When women are nursing, there's a phenomenon where the baby starting to suckle at the breast causes milk to be released from the glands in the breast and then travel down toward the nipple where the baby can get it. Now, as it turns out, oxytocin is also strongly involved in functioning of the brain involved in social bonding. When there's oxytocin release, it affects how the brain processes social cues, and it tends to be involved in the formation of intense bonds. So oxytocin seems to be released when people engage in various kinds of enjoyable social interactions. Kissing, for example, seems to cause oxytocin release, as does sexual activity. There is some evidence that you get oxytocin release during orgasm. But that oxytocin seems to be involved in forming those intense social bonds. It has interesting interactions. There's some new research about how people regard in-group versus out-group. There's some evidence, for example, that oxytocin strengthens the bonding to people that you identify as part of your in-group and increases the aversiveness to people who are considered out-group. So it plays an interesting and complex role in how we do social bonding. So oxytocin, the stimulus for oxytocin release, there are things like we mentioned, possibly kissing, possibly orgasm, but more often we think of it as nipple stimulation, and that's in both men and women. Stimulating the nipples causes oxytocin release, which then causes contractions it causes the milk letdown reflex and can also cause contractions in the uterine muscle. And during labor, the pressure of the baby's head on the cervix, the stretching of the cervix out around the head, causes oxytocin release, which is one of the examples of a positive feedback loop in the body. Excuse me. So during labor, the pressure of the baby's head on the cervix, stretching it out, causes oxytocin release, which increases the strength of the uterine contractions, which stretches the uterus more, which causes more oxytocin release. So you get that positive feedback loop, which leads to the very powerful contractions of labor. In any case, so these two hormones are made in the hypothalamus, travel down these axons into the posterior pituitary, and are released there in the blood. So the signal that causes their release is mostly neuronal. That comes from signals in the nervous system. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, is actually glandular tissue. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. All right, let's talk about the anterior pituitary now. So we've gone over the posterior. Now let's talk about how the anterior pituitary works. So our anterior pituitary is an actual gland rather than the posterior, which is nerve tissue. The anterior pituitary is glandular tissue, and it secretes hormones which mostly affect other glands in the body. So it secretes hormones that control other glands, which we call trophic hormones. So this is mostly secreting trophic hormones, which means hormones that target other glands. So rather than necessarily directly causing an effect, although sometimes they do, their effect is more to control the secretion of other hormones. So here's the ones that the anterior pituitary puts out something called thyroid stimulating hormone, which is usually just called TSH. So that controls the release of thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland. It secretes adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as ACTH. It's a great word, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Take a look at it. Adreno, the adrenal gland. Cortico, the cortex part of the adrenal gland. Tropic, targeting. So this is a hormone which targets the adrenal cortex. This mostly controls the secretion of cortisol, which is a steroid hormone from the adrenal cortex that it's released in response effectively to stress, and it has some complex effects involving modulating the immune system, changing some stuff about glucose and fat metabolism in a way that's meant to help the body deal with temporary stressful situations. We may not, but cortisol is pretty interesting stuff. There's a lot of evidence that cortisol is very helpful for our body if it is secreted in the short term. That way it helps our body deal with stress, but long term can cause damage. our body doesn't deal with it if it's elevated indefinitely, which is kind of a theme for our body. Our bodies do really well dealing with stress, responding to difficult situations if the stress goes away. But if you're under a situation where you are under constant, unrelieved stress, then the same responses our body has that are adaptive to deal with short-term stress become destructive over time. Cortisol is one of those things. For example, cortisol in the short term actually helps with memory formation, which may be part of the way that when stressful and frightening things happen to us, we often fix them in our memory, which is probably largely adaptive. It's a way of saying, don't forget this thing. This is something to pay attention to. But long-term cortisol release can actually impair memory formation. So, anyway, but moving on back to the anterior pituitary. It secretes two hormones that affect the reproductive system. Follicle-stimulating hormone, known as FSH, and luteinizing hormone, also known as LH. These are sometimes called gonadotropins. I'll put that word over here. Because they target the gonads, the ovaries or testes. They are involved in regulating the menstrual cycle in people with ovaries, and they're involved in sperm production in people with testes. So, there's 4 of them. 2 more. Growth hormone. Sorry, I didn't say what these do. These control... They control the production of gametes, as well as they're involved in secretion of estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. We're just going to say they're involved in controlling the gonads, including hormone secretion from the gonads. And then growth hormone, which targets the liver. One of its functions is controlling the secretion of something called insulin-like growth factor 1 from the liver, which has a role to play in controlling body growth, especially during puberty, and building of tissue throughout life. And then finally, prolactin. So, prolactin largely targets one of its main functions is targeting milk production in breast tissue. But the more we study prolactin, the more we find out that it's involved in a whole lot of things. There are prolactin receptors in a lot of places around the body, and it seems to be involved in regulating some aspects of behavior. It interacts with the immune system. It does a lot of interesting things. But one of its functions is to control milk production at the glands in the breast. So, 6 hormones, 6 trophic hormones from the anterior pituitary. Thyroid-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, and prolactin, all from the anterior pituitary. And those target other glands in the body. So then the one question becomes, okay, how are these controlled? I mean, seeing this is what leads people to consider the anterior pituitary the master gland. But there's actually something else that controls this, and that's the hypothalamus. So, let's take a moment here to look at that. So I'm going to zoom this out just a bit. So now here's our hypothalamus, and here's our pituitary gland. Now, let's consider some hypothalamic hormones. Now, the hypothalamus is nerve tissue. It's part of the brain. But the cells here, in addition to working as nerve cells, they also release neurohormones. So they release what might otherwise be a neurotransmitter, but they put it into the blood, so it acts as a hormone. And what we've got up here is a number of blood vessels, a set of capillaries up here, that then feed into another set of capillaries down here in the anterior pituitary. So this is one of these interesting systems where we have one set of capillaries that is followed by another set of capillaries, what's sometimes known as a portal system. So here, neurohormones from hypothalamic cells are put into the blood up here and then have an effect right here in the anterior pituitary. These are what are known as releasing hormones, named because when they show up, when they're put in here, they trigger the release of hormones in the anterior pituitary. So this is how one of the ways the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. So first we have thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. This controls secretion of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. So TRH from here causes the secretion of TSH from here, which then affects the thyroid gland and causes it to secrete thyroid hormones. So multiple step control here. There's another one called corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, which controls the secretion of ACTH. So we've got another one, growth hormone releasing hormone, known as GHRH. You might be able to guess that controls the secretion of growth hormone. So you're noticing a pattern here. For the hormones from the anterior pituitary, we have releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. Another one, gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, usually made with a small n, which controls secretion of FSH and LH. So there's releasing hormones for that control TSH, ACTH, GH, FSH, and LH. There was one more anterior pituitary hormone, though. That was prolactin. And interestingly, there is not a prolactin releasing hormone. Instead, prolactin secretion is controlled by dopamine release. From the hypothalamus. And unlike these other releasing hormones, where each of them stimulates the release of their anterior pituitary hormone, so for example, TRH causes the anterior pituitary to put out more TSH, dopamine inhibits prolactin release. So the more dopamine the hypothalamus puts out, the less prolactin the anterior pituitary secretes. So here we've got a multi-step process, and we're going to do a little more yet. The hypothalamus produces releasing hormones, which then cause the secretion of anterior pituitary hormones, which target other glands in the body and cause the secretion of hormones from those other glands. Now, In all the other hormones we've talked about so far, like parathyroid and insulin glucagon, we've looked at negative feedback systems. This one also involves negative feedback, but the negative feedback here is in an even more complicated multi-step process. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. All right, let's look at negative feedback in how the hypothalamus and pituitary gland interact with other glands in the body. So sometimes people group these into things they call the axes. So for example, we might now talk about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which you will sometimes see called the HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Now, there are also a couple of others that work similarly. For example, the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, HPT. And the hypothalamic pituitary gonad axes. All of these work in a somewhat similar way. So we're going to use the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis as our model. The other ones are similar. So let's take a look at how this works. So we're going to start with the hypothalamus. And it's going to affect the anterior pituitary. Which is in turn going to affect the adrenal cortex. So on our picture here, let's put in our adrenal gland here on top, and the cortex is this part out here. Now, the hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone which affects the anterior pituitary. You know what that is. That's corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH. The CRH has a stimulating effect on the anterior pituitary. So CRH from here stimulates the anterior pituitary, causing it to secrete its hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which has a stimulating effect on the adrenal cortex, causing the adrenal cortex to secrete its hormone, cortisol. So, we started with the nervous system up here decides it's time for cortisol release. And it tells the hypothalamus, make CRH. So the CRH is released here and affects the anterior pituitary. It tells the anterior pituitary, make adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it makes ACTH, puts it in the blood, which goes to the adrenal cortex and says, make cortisol. So the adrenal cortex makes cortisol and releases it into the blood. Remember, it's a steroid. So cortisol is now released in the blood. In order for this to be a negative feedback system, we're going to need to have something come along and reduce the production of these hormones. And as it turns out, that's cortisol. Cortisol exerts negative effects on both of these. So when the adrenal cortex puts out cortisol, that tells the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, calm down, don't secrete as much of your hormone. So, to put all that together, nervous system says, I'm stressed, I need cortisol. So it says, hey, hypothalamus, make CRH. And the CRH says, hey, anterior pituitary, make ACTH. And the ACTH says, hey, adrenal cortex, make cortisol. And we start putting cortisol into the blood. And as cortisol levels rise, pretty soon there's enough cortisol to tell the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, stop making your hormone. So we don't make as much CRH, and we don't make as much ACTH, which means we don't make as much cortisol, so cortisol levels stop rising. There's our negative feedback system. Now, I could imagine on an exam asking you to sketch out how this would work in the other axes as well. So, for example, if you were going to try to set out how this might work in the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, you've still got hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, and now you've got the thyroid gland. Think about what hormones would be in those particular places for that axis. Or for the gonadotropin axis. Hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, gonads. Think about what hormones would be here. What does the hypothalamus release that could affect the anterior pituitary? What does the pituitary release, which might affect the gonads? And what hormones do the gonads make that might affect the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary? So, that's just an illustration of a more complex, multi-level negative feedback system that we use for large-scale hormonal control like this. So now you've seen several examples of how hormone release is controlled in the endocrine system. And that's the end of the endocrine system. Coming up next, we should have a digestive system, which is pretty cool. See you then.